do not undermine IP. It's not an obstacle, but rather the key proposal to weaken IPR will reduce incentives for these technologies, including exclusions of climate-related technology without chilling effect on global innovation. This is clearly undesirable. Independently, online gambling prohibitions force the U.S. to make new commitments to compensate that's hollowed out LNG regulation. Against find stronger than the IPCC approach to Earth approach, specific statistical models to determine Earth limit to land temperature for the back time we studied urban heating, data selection, pore station quality, human intervention, and data adjustment. None of these rise to conclusions. Temperature patterns it has disrupted the match emissions of volcanic eruptions. El Nino is not statistically significant. The best match was carbon dioxide measured from atmospheric samples, air trapped and polarized. We learned from satellite measurements that solar activity changes for some very little. Any alternative explanation was matched today as well as carbon dioxide adding methane does not change the results. It's not too late. Emissions reductions can avoid and delay catastrophic impacts. Chesney and 13, the world can avoid much of the damaging effects of climate change. Emissions occur more sharply than studies. The first comprehensive system of cutting emissions going with impact altogether, but it will buy time to make buildings transparent and ag more resilient. Warming causes extinction. Brandenburg and 9-angle warming plus ice crystals in stratosphere. The sea rise of childhood. It will be very long and drawn out struggle. It would raise about organized north or any guarantee the new system would not also debate a more radical approach. Climate change begins not with an honest engagement with a very compressed time frame. Current climate science implies climate science believe that any increase in temperatures beyond 2 degrees will lead to dangerous climate change, and adaptation means preparing to live with the effects of climatic changes. Climate migration adaptation are merely after by time the climate system unravels will better off. Advantage to his framing, our use of legal education is productive. Questions of how to use law are more important than its ideological construction. Seeding that training ground locks into present policies. Matsuda in 14, we need to revive the lawyer as a social critic and think of the threats we face. Do not stay with them and rise to scenario buildings to fall apart across self-perfection. A linear projection bias. Scholars who have fear of how the world's operating the present may well project into the future. A scenario project lets research think about multiple futures. Scenarios are a key part of learning. Rather than asking students to take on the world of the present, students may be presented with a vignette and asked to analyze strategic application scenario. Rather than focus on policy decisions alone, the students are forced to bring direct logic to bear to test the boundaries of the scenario. Thinking to write about the future in a robust way offers an exciting opportunity to push the boundaries of current debates and generate new ones. The one who sees narrative environmental risk is motivating and drives individual activism development into apocalypse that goes hand in hand with activism. The group who perceives the progressive describe climate change using apocalyptic language is such apocalypse and encourage fatalism. We would expect alarmists to be less likely to have engaged in environmental behavior. To the contrary, alarmists were significantly more likely to take personal action to reduce emissions and response to perceived climate change pose lots of a threat. The alarm are most engaged in the issue about global warming. The Americans it's already happening. Urgent alarm to already change their own lives to support an aggressive national response. It is specifically desired to work catastrophe that encourages pro-environmental behavior. Those who think environmental problems pose it's fear that practice action rather than giving way to fatalistic resignation. Apocalypse police also motivate lobbying, public information campaigns to shift legislative problems. People who move beyond making superficial changes, making substantial permanent ones, are quite likely to subscribe to the apocalyptic narrative. Association not arbitrary. There's something powerful and compelling about the apocalyptic narrative. And innovation centuries. The message should be persuasive. Stories encourage action. The world even they evoke an imaginary one. We try to continuation of our own narrative. Apocalyptic narrative helps adherents determine how to act by providing storyline for which they can imagine an example, enabling them to assess consequences of their action. Acts as narrative disaster makes such reasoning impossible. Therefore, a single framework within which people can consider and eventually arrive at some conclusion. But obligations, apocalyptic narrative seem perfectly well suited for encouraging pro-environmental behavior without the narrative concept of impeding disaster decisions. We merely in matters of convenience, putting information by the environment to an narrative from enables apocalypse to think, link global environment to process to their own life. Limit that every little helps. Whoever does little will only achieve a little task. Committed must be to motivate active demand for policy interventions. Government space, poverty change may become diversions. More important political pressure to bear on policymakers. Government communication to work to normalize public space. slow pace to political change. Communication play a role fostering demand for change. The law is malleable. Debating is the only way to affect change. Hatred into a democratic legal system has the capacity to shape environment to other systems. The law is uniquely open to inputs from ordinary language and in response to democratic will formations. While social spheres can be conceived as autonomous, the boundaries are legal defined in ways that affect interaction. Constitutional discourse should be seen as attempts to articulate legal norms that shift the balance between spheres in a manner more effective, reflective of generalizable interest current amidst class stratification. Citizens are practice part meaningfully impact the terms of their relation to each other. Inculcated to rise with their marks exposure applies sharp critique of bourgeois constitution. Such models represent the law as a term of as sustainable to professional subordinate complex struggles for culture and inclusion, problematic and core clearly affect the outcomes of these conflicts. As some find constitution quixotic, with the narrative possibly losing direction, authoritarian conception, law, political power, and isolation, social recapturing how human activities, ongoing organization of society can move into innovation, ongoing practice, communication, lawmaking, and a vision that seeks to reconcile, overcome division without pretension of ever being able to fully use and adopting a mindset of scientific inquiry for climate methodology for climate change makes sense because it's a phenomenon uniquely suited to an empiricist methodology. Brick bonds in one. Let us try to epistemological opportunities we can erase and reality, radical perspectives cannot be refuted. There are absolutely no secure foundation. Nevertheless, we also be placed by contemporary reliable knowledge, reality, at least in everyday life. Can be given to scientific question, compounding direct observation, mental picture, mathematical formulation choices, made pragmatic reason for problem worse than the disease problem. The ideas taken rigid occupies realism and has something to really are is not plus some degree of approximation. Yep.
Your evidence talks about resources. What's a resource?
So like I don't have like a hard and fast definition of what resources means. That would require a dictionary. But in the context of our warming impact evidence, it's in things like food, water, other things, all these types of stresses that would be a function of climate change.
Are resources?
They're examples of resources, yes.
Okay, cool. Your Burkett evidence indicates that warming disproportionately impacts oppressed populations, so the affirmative is then, I guess, an intervention sort of within the state to prevent that sort of like racial gap from happening.
The F is certainly like an intervention of sorts, but the argument for why we solve warming is not so much we're an intervention so much as we have a reason why renewable technologies prevent warming and warming is bad.
Sure. I mean, maybe I phrased that weird. I mean, in terms of, right, like if people are disproportionately impacted by warming, the affirmative attempts to address the gap that exists between people who are less proportionally impacted.
We think that warming creates that disparity and that solving warming would alleviate that.
Solving warming through the state, correct?
The app is a use of the state. We advocate for use of the state.
Word. Cool. So you read a piece of, I think, Matsuda evidence that talks about how the law is key and legal education is good. This is literally a professor like saying that some of their students like are into human rights and stuff. In what way does that prove that like the law is valuable?
I think that you're selling this evidence a little short. It's in the context of how law is a malleable tool open to revision, and it can be useful in order to shape.
From it that are like some of my students never even practice law, and then it says in a
You're correct that Matsuda is a professor.
Straight into organizational and transactional work. I don't know why that proves that.
So you're correct that Matsuda is indeed a professor of law, but that piece of evidence is in the context of the malleability of the law and how it's open to revision and can be used to construct positive things, even if it's not always good. The idea that it's malleable means that it's open to revision, and i.e., if there are some bad parts of the law, we can work to make it better in the future.
We can work to make it better in the future. That's great. So you read this piece of development evidence that talks about how people who were alarmists, I guess, were more likely to have taken personal action, it says, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this piece of evidence seems to indicate that because people carpool when they're scared of warming, you're absolved.
So like that's obviously a simplification of that piece of evidence. It's in the context of how apocalyptic narratives and
that's the only line I could find in it.
There are plenty of better lines. For example, the apocalyptic narrative seems particularly well suited to encouraging pro-environmental behavior without the narrative context of impending disaster. Decisions being merely matters of convenience. The part above that is in the context of how public information campaigns that stress the impact of warming have translated into increased lobbying efforts at the legislative level.
Okay, cool.
That's one reason, but it's just not about like carpooling.
So then you also say empirics are good. What is empirical?
Like in a very specific context, right?
Empirical scientific inquiry and empiricism.
In the context of warming, it makes the most sense because warming is a scientific issue that necessitates understanding.
Okay.
Can I use that?
Yeah.
1 minute.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I literally don't know how to use it.
You could put it down here for this if you want.
It's too cramping.
Oh, okay. Do you need I was gonna offer to move your backpack so that you don't have to
mean, if you want to change all the like stuff, so just turn it upside down, and then. Wait, sorry. Are you like trying to make it shorter? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you just like turn it upside down, and flip it over,
Just stay on.
and you just twist them left, loosen them, then twist them right to. Yeah. So now it's loosening. You should be able to just push it. No. That one's weird. Oh. There you go. Yes, whatever you want.
That's still kind of tall.
Yeah, it really is.
Maybe just put those bottom ones like all the way down. This is why I give
That's better.
speeches sitting down.
If you turn it upside down,
Yeah,
Oh,
we.
that's
Yeah,
fine.
okay.
That's okay.
And it's all just paper,
Yep.
right? Yep.
Everyone good? You good, Jeff?
You said just straight down.
Yeah, just straight down.
Decolonization must occur in this space. We use kinetic energy to turn our theory into practice, tucking yang. An ethic of incommensurability which guides and moves and unselves innocent stands in contrast to aim and reconciliation, which motivates settler movements to innocence. Reconciliation is about rescuing settler normacy, about rescuing a settler future. It's concerned with the question of what will decolonization look like, what will happen after evolution, what will happen, what will be the consequences of decolonization for the settler. Incommensurability acknowledges that these questions need not and perhaps cannot be answered in order for decolonization to exist as a framework. Decolonization is not accountable to settler futurity. Decolonization is accountable to indigenous sovereignty and futurity. The answers will not emerge from friendly understanding, indeed require dangerous understanding of uncommonality. That uncoalesced coalition politics moves that may feel unfriendly. We will find out the answers as we get there. In the exact measure that we can discern the movements which give decolonization historical form and content to fully enact the ethic of incommensurability, which means relinquishing settler futurity, abandoning the hope that settlers may one day be commensurable to native people, removing asterisks, periods, commas, apostrophes, the whereabouts, busted conditional clauses that punctuate decolonization underwrite settler innocence. Decolonization offers a different perspective to human civil rights and basic approach to justices, an unsettling one rather than a complementary one. Decolonization is not an and, it is an elsewhere. You want to see as a modernist reform project, the affirmative call for action on warming is doomed to failure. Ecological catastrophe is inevitable in the status quo and post the passage of the plan. The affirmative reproduces a myth of government responsiveness to environmental crisis, strengthening the modernity and calcifying the colonial project. The Laurentian participates in the Project Forum movement, marching project modernity, which maintains a fancy of their own innocence, complicity within colonialism. We have arrived at a moment in critical theory and critical dance studies where the political problem in contemporary modernity, capitalism, and action have been theoretically cast as essentially belonging to the realm of choreographic ontology and modernity. This is fundamental development not only in critical theory but also of the possible theoretical intervention. Critical dance studies may attempt in its analysis of subjectivity. Modernity is a long durational project, metaphysically and historically producing and reproducing inside a physiological frame. With a privileged subject, discourse is always gendered as heteronormative male versus white. Experiences is always gendered as truth, and within the ceaseless drive for autonomous and self-motivated, endless, spectacular movement, which ground the kinetic subject moves about apparently without effort, apparently always energized and never stumbling. Whereas this inescapable topography, fantasy of modernity informs its choreo-political formation. For modernity imagines its topography is already abstracted from the grounding on the land previously occupied by other human bodies, other life forms, and filled with the dynamic of gesture, steps, and temporalities. The emergence of the modernity as an ideology of beginning modernity as the new temple of his non-place becomes a colonial place. The ground from modernity is colonized, flat, and bold, terrain with fantasies of endless and self-sufficient motility take place. There is no such thing as a self-sufficient living system, no all mobilization, all activity that finds itself as a self-sufficient living system, all mobilization being totally moving forward, and must draw its energy from some sort of fantasy of modern kinetic subject. It's a spectacle of modernity. As movement happens in innocence, kinetic spectacle of modernity erases the picture of movement from all ecological catastrophes, personal tragedies, communal disruptions, options brought about by the colonial pruning of resource bodies and subjectivities that are bound, that are in need in order to keep modernity's most real reality its place, kinetic being. Given that all social and political creation data takes place within the framework of colonialism and its current metamorphosis to African post-colonial theory and critical race studies as the fundamental partners of critically assessing how some of this contemporary dance and kinetic performances challenges colonialism and its new guide. The root cause of when they see harms is settler colonialism. Only our land ethic can solve. The affirmative is more than the same. Navarro 14. If we understand native identity spatially rather than temporally based claims that are based now on land but solely prior occupancy, but on radical relationality of the land, in order to decolonize, we must critically assess our present state and name the reason that native people continue to live at the margins and must account for the way the state of our homeland. Solarize, relational stance on within the land reimagining the role of art and arts and healing process of decolonization and fundamentally links native sovereignty and black sovereignty to one another. Solarize not only builds a land ethic within the opening lines I mentioned in the hook, but also a position is also found in the middle of the song when Desiree Harp sings about the broader history of environmental racism as tied to imperialism and decolonization and subsequent codification in our legal and social system. These acts of inclusion assimilate indigenous sovereignty and the ways of knowing and being a market collective comprised tribal identity and individualized ethnic identity. From a decolonization perspective, the asterisk the body account does not account for the indigenous politics, educational concerns of epistemologies, urban land, indeed, and land, native land. Don't just talk about it, be about it. Legal education and debate over warming has been occurring for decades. The affirmative's talking advantages are not unique. We must look for the better alternatives to environmental crisis that we are more likely to motivate people. Movement is crucial to politics. We must renegotiate relationship to spatiality and the land to curtail environmental disaster. Lepecki. This mode of subjectification allows subjectivity within the experience of being separate from the world. The centrality of the subject experience is his or hers, fully independent, ontologically separate from the world, is constituted of the modern process of subjectification. The inclusion of kinetic energy and political ethical question of modern subjectivity brings us back to the problem of how to dance again against the hegemonic fantasy of modernity, and one of those fantasies is linked to the imperative to constantly display mobility, and this is where analysis, choreographies, and performances that directly address the impossibility of sustaining forward continuum movement or theoretical or political import. We examine the notion of mobilization understands mediating concepts between dance and politics. Mobilization is key dance studies must probe in order to step out of dubious political paralysis. The formation of the political theory and political practice based on the primacy of movement, the relationship to dance and land, understood the formation of political theory and political practice based on primacy of movement. Relationship of dance and political theory cannot be usually taken as merely analogical or metaphorical. Considering literal relations between dance and politics become fundamental stuff for political theory to adjust the choreographic dynamics of social movement and social change. Regardless of those movements, change manifest themselves on stage or in the streets. There's a politics full ideas that have less been successful in articulating how the concrete labor of participation necessary to execute those ideas is gathered through the movement of bodies in the social time and space. Our alternative is to decolonize, tucking in. Two distinct but overlapping types. First, concern about how the invisible dynamics of settler colonialism mark the organization, governance, curricula, and assessment of compulsory learning. The other concern about how settler perspective and worldviews get counted as knowledge and research, and how the other maintain unfair social structures. We have been thinking about what decolonization means, what it wants and requires. Language decolonization has been superficially adopted to education and other social sciences, supplementing other ways of talking about social justice, critical methodology, and approach to decentered settler perspective. Decolonization, which asserts a distinct project from the other civil human rights-based social justice projects, far too often assuming the directives of these projects no regard to how decolonization works or something different from what it actually wants. To signal the significance of indigenous decolonizing theorization of schooling, educational research, and to include indigenous people on the list of consideration and additional special ethnic group class. A starting number of these discussions make no mention of indigenous people or struggle of recognition of sovereignty, contribution, indigenous intellectual and activist theorization of framework and decolonization in the immediate context of our settler colonialism of North American lands, where many of the conferences take place. This kind of inclusion is form of enclosure dangerous, how it domesticates decolonization is also a foreclosure limiting how it recapitulates dominant theories of social change when the metaphor of basic decolonization kills the very possibility of decolonization and recenters whiteness and resells theories, and it extends the innocence of the settler and interchanges settler futurity. Decolonization of urban decolonization now cannot be easily grafted on pre-existing discourses, frameworks, even if they are critical, even if anti-racist, even if they are justice frameworks, the easy absorption, adoption, and transposing of decolonization is yet another form of appropriation. Decolonization is not a swappable term for for other things we want and to improve our society and schools. And decolonization doesn't have a synonym. The affirmative continues to sell a colonial lie that black people are landless and geoterritorial approach to blackness is a prerequisite to their resistance. Smith 14. Native studies often articulate being concerned primarily with colonization and decolonization, while black studies articulate as being primarily with race and anti-racism distinguishes itself as a part of anti-blackness. The colonization of Africa must be appear so that Africa can appear to be ontologically colonized according to just standards. Or since only nations can be colonized, nations of Africa never really existed. It's only through the disavowal of colonization that black people can be ontologically relegated to the status of property.
Will you mark it?
Yes. Just mark it. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, we pray, that's why the main reason we all can see the sky. The stars dim down and the sun don't shine. It's the earth keeps spinning and we waste more time. The earth is heating up, just like microwave food, but they tell you eat it up. Global warming doesn't exist, nah, I don't pay attention. That's for your future goals when things missing. Life, man, acid rain destroys the asphalt that I walked on. Empty stomach, so my thoughts gone. Humans created this perish upon ourselves, so instead of just popping bottles of body, just pop some help. But it's ice melting. And I know the water's not as cold as it used to be, even though I know I've never felt it, man. You see this greenhouse gas, got to see the foam blast, trying to turn this whole world into ash.
Cross that.
Okay. What is
Flip this
the
back.
Oh yeah. What is the decolonization method?
Decolonization is itself a method. We've performed the method in this debate if you want to ask questions about that.
Well, before I get to that, I just want to know what that entails. What does decolonization entail with relation to the? Hold
That
on.
is exactly what the Tuck and Yang evidence is indicting.
So I got.
Tuck and Yang say,
Sorry. I know what your Tuck and Yang evidence says in the context of how questions of like what it will look like, what will happen after abolition, and what are the consequences are part of the project of reconciliation. My question is, why shouldn't we focus on those consequences?
because that just reconciles and preserves a settler future. That's exactly it.
Okay, how does your
Clearly
alter-
you don't know what the evidence says. Because
Okay,
you're confused.
let's talk about how does decolonization relate to climate politics, for example.
Sure. So we read a really good piece of Navarro evidence in which she talks about a native feminist land ethic. I think Khalil made a good analytic argument as well, right? That like if we really are to look at warming and how warming begins to happen, like it happens in CX of the 1AC when I'm like, what are resources? And
Okay,
we're like, oh, that's
so-
like food and
sorry,
water.
I just need to ask
you
a
know,
few-
like commodifiable
I just need to ask some
things
more
that we
questions. What
use.
exactly does your method do to address the climate change problem?
Sure, so our argument, right, is that what underlies climate change and global warming as a form of systemic violence against people of color, as your app identifies, is the original sort of commodification of land and bodies.
So
right,
you
which we
identify
see in
that,
the
what do you do about it?
context. Well, the same question could be asked of y'all. What do you? What the fuck do
Well,
you do about
we
it?
advocate
Our
for a
argument-
plan that
You
solves
already
that, but I'm-
acknowledged that.
our
No, you
argument
already
is-
acknowledged that.
Okay.
That
I have
people,
another-
people of color are not directly
sorry, I have to
responsible
move
for
on. I
warming.
have
So
another
if we solve
question. Does the-
decolonization, how are we not
I have
solving
another
it?
question. Does the alt agree with the scientific understanding of climate change?
No.
So then how do you understand climate change?
From
No.
a native feminist
Yes.
perspective.
So what does that mean?
Science is the same shit that says that Africa and the U.S. are the same size when in actuality Africa is 8 times bigger than
Okay,
the
we
U.S.
would disagree
Science
with that,
is
but
fucking
I'm still
racist. Relying on science is only furthering
So
only
all
strengthening
science is
settler
racist? Is
colonialism.
your claim that climate change really has no scientific
Coming up from a
basis?
Eurocentric point of view, yes.
So it has no
Wait,
scientific
can I-
basis. The
can I
fact that
jump
there are
in?
Go for it.
carbon in the
That's
atmosphere is not
I
something
Are you
you
gonna
can
let her
I
talk?
need you to keep talking.
Oh, for sure.
Our argument is not even, you don't even have to take it to, even though I don't believe in science, you don't have to take it to science is always wrong about everything. However, science is a framework for understanding that emerges from European Enlightenment thought. So if there's an alternative, there are certainly actually alternative frameworks of understanding
And
how
I'm
warming
trying to get at
operates.
what those are.
I would contend that the 1AC's interpretation has already attempts to preclude those things as evidenced by your behavior.
You really
in
haven't
this
explained
one
what
ACS.
the alt does, though. So now, how does the alt solve the status of black people as property? That was a line in your evidence. How does the alt solve that?
Yeah, so the alternative, right, because decolonization, this is again the whole settler innocence.
So it seems like a
retreat.
retreat into not explaining what the alt does. Or is there any part of the alt that you can explain how it solves black people as
Well,
property?
you don't want me to
climate
talk about the performance, so no.
I'm gonna take a little bit of prep.
Yes, you will.
To what they too late even if the wins some root cause argument says of the current act of the plan to keep developing affordable skills and correctly can be used to about educated and called the debate over legalization and heuristic for approaches to activism and policy refinement only if we get the only if we gauge the thought experiment, the affirmative. Go good. Outside debate to resolve and learn about the laws of production that's misuse evidence of increasing and sensitivity to the ability to scenario planning about the climate is key to develop effective response to climate change. Good evidence. Additionally, our injection of positive directive relating to what gets good to then motivate the action outside the debate. That's about the evidence mode about the science about through we can measure etc. It's also not the one for the fence. The science is just more rigorous approach to doing that. It's an exact science that records a technological personal experiences of approach to climate change, creates systemic kinds of accidents. The link from the personal experience related to systematic advice and center of the climate change is positive taxi, let's take the climate change of the diverse experience. Affected that the point indicators that transparent as I designed all the consequences of climate change comment, as I discovered the reactor with their life and athletic processing, accumulation, data statistical descriptions, and about the percent of scientific collaboration and painted campaign with the sense of non-science is different scientists with it, the way you back to the uncertainty, the alternative is not, the music switch with the affirmative inability to describe the world post all about the proofs we can, of the proofs we can affirm the planet is a provisional good in, embrace about the period of grace, the back analysis, even with when the lecture scholarship academic distance is good. Higgins, 13, the diversity viewpoints selected to test by the sense of our field, the creative interpretation of this proliferation viewpoints makes it challenging, democratically Jessica, never responsible for place we can because the nature problems of other systems because it's defined with the virtual bias and forward V3, which people are taking that up one to many, a different perspective, how they take multiple sex and then mind, looks at more sex about the possible intervention problems for creative, appropriate alternative possibilities for certain response to problems are, arguing that if you doubt the obstacle, the taking, a common action become the can be to, and the disagreeing still engaging, a practical the still engage pragmatic action, the warming is now, it's a doubt that's a decades of extreme suffering that hurts everyone, especially about for billions of the world's most harsh, it's broken up and failure, and practice of radicalized, not radical anti-waiter, about the anti-colonial, it's morally grotesque, and the dupes of planting ecological catastrophe, usual, it's on the road for 9% together for responsibility to make, and also the participation of the potential result of which is out to develop together goes made discovered because responsibility is like the ethical responsibility can account it and looking at the point of concerns on these two let's have experts and done intense and but disaster results is morally defective. The state is key to solve war, but it's the only way to implement big enough changes. Individual action fails and trades off with those the larger structural change that's parentheses well as CAG there. Critique the state is way too totalized in one instance, but justifying the state intervention is justified in this case the affirmative. There should not be conflated with all past wrongs of the state. Brubaker, 04. The category of the next of the community who be found the state next to work next to the six way get on. We can also work in a different family inclusive way not. There's those people with all those people horsemen perpetuate the version of the name of the name of the horsemen against the name of together matching of the match and match increase and that's the band of the things there that they're hundred flood the flexible political language of the identification ones against the ground responsibility rather than the disengagement by action they were the responsibility does not apply or agree with the main a joint power promotion is shame and anger not apply then motivate opposition government policy commitments identify such motions which are convinced motivated of this is now of the civic engagement. Root cause claims are a junk. There are too many variables to actually prove cause other than even if they're right about them. It does not prove the solvency of the affirmative. We have had commodification research for thousands of years, but only serious climate change in the last roughly 100 years. Even if all their historical prescriptions are true, that does not mean that the rejection of the state now save the cell perm to the alternatives. Plant plastic provides self-determination to other tribe plantations in the United States because that includes the ban on the gambling reject black life impacts. It's never impossible to make a black judgment for someone else in insistence and in distinct indigenous perspective. They say the worst one, but the worst one. All the centralists of describe zero centrism, utilizing the beta stab like exclusion ground parental Polatino, or 3 elements and introduced by the acknowledgement assessing the gender of the case of division of the native on the net conscious and research debates and building critical perspective takes a the separate sense and assessing and distinctive and the perspective the advance of the 14 Africa and the sort of extracting Indians of the Indigenous and the Geocentric that and fact that it's together of European consciousness instead of participant that like the separate positions out of the Geneva about categories of Western Geocentric thinking insistence I need division between and retreat from Western institutional law results in a form of violent nationalism. Fifth with 7 speakers, a conflict there should send the fake flank to the profession academic the disciplines while they sing one about the shape of the gender and the term about the 12 culture being said they said about the possible for not the country for Friday days that different without the church being a colonist becomes difficult to like the discourse the very ethnocentric cloning discourse these speaks get the understanding of the third also the discourse may be about the fault going to their other essentials of the nationalist was found now this passage from by Choming ideology which is the German expression the Nazi just led World War II the these nationalists got all the critics and not said there about the nationalists the third then forms the predicate as something that which forms the forms of the conservative let's call this the one to see focus on aesthetics and prioritizing performance to trace out with broader collective action keen 14 from the forms of the social does have to be divided into white black that these psychological defense of this relation of the relations with the arctic of the constructed and threat the ultimate effects when it's maybe so the maybe so the something that something becomes identity hospitality separation does not follow the avoid blocking effects at the transit of the transit until the transit of the signified which all of all the forms of self ways black notes is by until the signification with no about how diagnosed and anti-colonial political set all the structure of the reactivation of colonial objectivity reject. Yeah. The only
We can
card in
start.
the dock I skipped was Melson.
Yeah, you can start. Or start, whatever.
Alright. Okay, good. Why do we need to overcome the binaries between Native and Euro-Americans?
Because the idea that they are inherently irreconcilable is an essentialist understanding of Native epistemology.
Who's that?
We think that there can be a productive synthesis of Western understandings with Native understandings.
Is that the app?
Not necessarily, no. That can be the permutation, though.
Okay. And how are Euro-American theory and Native theory bound together?
I wouldn't say it's an American theory. Sort of, we're saying that ways of understanding the world that are traditionally conceived of as Western
I mean, well,
can work
first-
with those that are traditionally conceived of as Native.
Well,
We don't think there are any binary categories.
That implies that Native Americans are Americans, but they're not. They're their own sovereign nation, so I don't understand how the two are co-constitutive. Please tell me.
So, evidence I read is about how the communities can work together, how they can have epistemologies that can synthesize together to produce more effective
One is a native
solutions.
sovereign nation, one reservation system, and the other one is white people walking around on land that isn't theirs. I don't see how the two communities can work together when they aren't really communities. One's a nation. You're referring to it as a community. Whatever. So how does the act solve for the billions of deaths of people of color? Through warming?
We prevent warming, which then would have those consequences.
What is the so you solve for warming? How does that still solve for the billions of deaths of people of color that are bound to happen eventually due to colonialism? Or the billions of deaths that have already happened?
I mean, so the affirmative doesn't resolve colonialism writ large, I don't think, but it is
Okay.
compatible with an approach that does so. Alternative.
What is the
And it also
How are you compatible?
makes that suffering way, way worse.
What?
Because if
Can you tell me
colonialism
what
is
is
bad,
the suffering?
colonialism with runaway warming is
What is the suffering?
off the charts.
What's suffering?
Sorry, suffering from warming or from colonialism?
Colonialism.
So economic deprivation, forms of structural violence. We can address those concerns.
YouTube.
Also backed up by the piece of evidence about progress occurring now in Native
Does
communities
the
in
act
the
believe
United
in the
States.
notion of progress?
Sorry?
Does the act believe in the notion of progress?
We think you can make things better, and especially that the future would be better if it was not one with warming in it.
Feels nothing with warming in it. Okay. Why is the focus on the aesthetics bad? And what's the trade-off that you're talking about?
Trade-off between the individual and collective. So aesthetics might be a good method that you can use as an individual to sort of cope with oppression, but it's not one that we should endorse to alter broader structures.
So the ass focus on the broad makes it a great plan.
So, I mean, we engage with legal structures, which we think can produce better outcomes for people. We've read quite a few cards that defend that.
Starting point. You really read this Iago evidence?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
didn't get it. I was okay. Did you want to know? Sometimes, even if I'm doing that, there's limited solvency for me.
Well, we can stop prep that's giving this you. And could I get that Smith card back so I can finish it, please?
Yeah.
Thank you. It'll be straight down.
Oh, and if possible, if there were like any cards, could like be passed on to this paper or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
The NEG is a decolonial project actualized through a red and black coalitionary politics that uses hip-hop and engages with artistic expression. There are 3 reasons why you should prefer the negative. First is kinetic energy, ethereal movement of bodies in time and space, which the affirmative ultimately has no access to. The question of movies focus because into any type of praxis, some type of penalizing in order to some kind of political strategy that fucking status quo with the president in praxis. The argument that we have is that we have a native key to addressing environmental issues that we play in the one ends with discourse of warming, the desertification of the land as property, and talks about that as the original possible in the first, and continues to mean that it impacts indigenous peoples in the global south because they can't presents the original kind of environment, i.e. in CX of the one what is a resource, and they're like specifically in talking about how water is part of her soul from the experience of space as a space that's argument and the link or project of decolonization and answerability. That's the piece of tucking. It indicates that we have to have an unsettling process that is not actually no. I'm going to answer this part. We're not engaged in any kind as a heuristic, not pragmatic. That's the piece of access to your pragmatic. Next, we aren't systematic analysis. I don't understand. You're going to synthesize any of ours. Obviously, are not engaged with us. That you have synthesized somehow native, and when you have clearly no to native communities, that is fucking ethnography. Don't talk to me about ethnography. The permutation is never going to get the fuck to be grateful now. You read this piece of evidence that's literally like native people should be grateful because there are 4 schools on Pine Ridge. Are you serious? That constitutes progress in the world of the affirmative. If that's what progress looks like, then clearly your legal heuristic is just not going to fucking cut it for any of us. Next, the permutation tax decolonization onto an existing framework, which is always just going to be violent. That treats decolonization as an empty signifier and ignores the absolute necessity of decommodifying and returning lands and red and black lands and bodies, which means that decolonization is just added onto an existing social project. That's a piece of Tuck and Yang evidence that we read in the 1AC. That's just a move. Innocence in the first place. That also means that you have to weigh decolonization against the act, because they came out when they say that we have to have an ethics of incommensurability that understands that the status quo and the politics of the status quo are radically incommensurable. Colonial work and anti-colonial actualized in the 1NC, so you don't get a fucking. The permutation makes absolutely no sense in a context where we are going to win some pretty important link arguments. First, I'm going to finish this piece of Smith evidence. Native peoples, by contrast, are situated as potential citizens. They may eventually become citizens if they were to renounce their relationship to their native nations, demonstrate the maturity required to become a citizen. Native peoples' apparent proximity to whiteness should not be understood as a pathway to freedom, as a pathway to genocide. Settler colonialism sets the very terms of contestation where you're supposed to contest settler democracy, to contest the gap between that settler democracy promises and what it performs. Contesting the racial gap of settler democracy is the most effective way of actually ensuring its universality. Settler colonialism does not merely operate by racializing native peoples, positioning them as racial minorities rather than colonized nations, but also through domesticating black struggle within the framework of anti-racist rather than anti-colonial struggle. Anti-blackness is effectuated through the disappearance of colonialism in order to render black peoples internal property of the United States within a domesticated anti-racist framework that cannot challenge the settler state itself. Not only are black people surrendered the property of the settler state, but black struggle itself remains property solely contained within the confines of the settler state. The U.S. must secure human and concealed from both internal and external threats that would threaten its legitimacy and continued existence. Indigenous peoples must be made to disappear as internal threats made to exist in the constant state of vanishing, in no position to unsettle the settler state. The external threat posed by a global black anti-colonial struggle is made to disappear by rendering Africa as the property of the U.S. Anti-blackness is not only constituent of the settler nation of the U.S., but integral to the normalization of which answers a bunch of their stuff, but also makes 3 important impact claims. Smith says that contesting the gap between what settler democracy promises and what it performs is precisely the problem. This is exactly what the AF is engaged in and why I asked those CX questions. This has 3 impacts. The first is that it domesticates black struggle because it always posits black people as being internal to the United States in no position to unsettle the settler state. It also relegates Africa to being the ontological property of the United States. The second argument that it makes is that it erases Native people as an internal minority that always has to appeal to the state rather than recognizing sovereignty claims, which is an important place that Khalil got in CX. The third argument is that it's always going to preserve the state. It's going to hermeneutically seal the state from any kind of intervention because the measure of how free we are or how much we have gained liberation is always going to be within the hermeneutic of the law. This is precisely why Native treaties have never actualized any kind of decolonization because the law is able to lock us violations of the status quo. Smith has also already assumed your Brubaker evidence and your Hudson evidence. We talk about anti-blackness as a process of exclusion, then that is exactly the that we should confer citizenship onto these people, but that just assumes a multicultural form of inclusion capable of solving, but that is literally the status quo, and obviously multicultural inclusive policies have not resolved anti-blackness because we see things like the prison industrial complex. The second link argument I'm going to go for is that the WTO is always going to be colonialist. This is because of its resource distribution is always going to be tied up in the commodification of land and bodies, which is literally settler colonialism, a claim that you have not contested. The next link argument is that legal education and your specific use of legal education and the law is colonialist. You say that doesn't have to be the case, but your specific one is because we have indicated that you are specifically using the state as a what constitutes good action for citizens, which means that even education might be good. Yours is certainly from a colonialist paradigm. Next, future link. This is also an actual simulation, but they're focused on a future without addressing the past or without talking about even about the relations of the present locks in colonialism and native disappearance. That's a piece of Navarro evidence that says understand native identity as spatial rather than temporal because understanding native identity temporally always locks native people into the past. The next link argument is progressiveness. They merely have a move towards, their entire affirmative is moved towards making settler colonialism better, towards improving settler society, towards making it easier for white people to have a home in this space, but that is exactly our argument. That's a pretty good framing through which you can filter the debate. If they win a survivability claim for white settlers, that is a disad to the affirmative. The argument is that global warming ignores spatial relations, and that's always going to be colonialist, that they don't have a solution to global warming that radically reformulates the way in which we think about space in the first place. They say essentialism. The first piece of Pulitano evidence they read is not us. It's a terrible card. It doesn't even make a fucking link argument to us. You should pull that piece of evidence. The second is a piece of Fitz evidence, but we'll say nationalism good, particularly in the context of black and red people. That's the Navarro evidence. They need to win some type of analysis of power that says that our brand of nationalism is somehow going to spiral into Nazi nationalism, which is probably a better characterization of the 1AC because the 1AC is engaged in a kind of multicultural progressivism Nazi party was using in the first place. They also say, I answer that argument above because we have the way in which art plays a role, and specifically the song and the kinetic energy of the 1NC. They say separatism, but our Tuck and Yang evidence has already indicated that binaries are good, and your evidence is not particularly well warranted. In addition, the impact is always going to outweigh because decolonization is a better risk to take than the risk that we might reify a couple of binaries, especially when I make the argument above on the permutation that it doesn't seem like you're engaged with any native communities. This also just reveals your settler anxiety in an attempt to reconcile the future and to make it commensurable, which is what the Tuck and Yang evidence say is bad. Next, you say absolute ethics are bankrupt, but racism is always bad. It's always, like, colonialism is gonna always be bad. That's just true. Like, yeah.
How does the method of decolonization resolve global warming, especially when the atmosphere is rapidly approaching 450
You already said in the first cross-section you acknowledged that people of color are not directly responsible for warming. So if we solve we do decolonization, we stop those structures that keep emitting the CO2 into the air because of fucking capitalism.
Sure, so
we stop all those structures that are
okay.
causing warming.
So what do you do about power plants, for example?
Right,
Or
I mean,
oil
it's
and
also,
cars?
Again, with the settler stuff, but in addition to that, it's also not like we're like, oh, we have a linear project that is going to unfold and be beautiful. Like, Tuck and Yang are specifically saying that decolonization is not going to be pretty, it's not going to make everyone feel happy, it's not going to have easy answers, because the world is violent and fucked up, and white people continue to do fucked up shit to native people. So, like, there's
What
not
do you
an
do
easy
about
answer
warming?
to your question.
What do you
My
mean
argument
what do you
is
do
that
about
warming is the result of the commodification of land, and
That
it
might
means
be
that
true.
warming is
What do you do
perpetuated.
about it?
You have conceded that it is true, one. You also have articulated that same relationship to land as a resource in the 1AC. So if it is true, it's probably a solvency deficit to the act.
Okay. What do you do about power plants? About oil used in cars?
If you
what do you
disrupt
do about
colonial,
China?
if you disrupt
Hold on, though,
colonization's ties to that land, then there can't be any power plants because Native people wouldn't allow those power plants on. If you put,
But it's
Okay.
like,
I
again,
can't
right, you're
disagree
asking
with
for
it.
all of these linear answers. You're, like, your
Cool.
own app is
What-
we should have gambling be legal. Like, the
All
fuck
right.
does that app do about
What do you
warming?
do about the United States as an entity that occupies territory?
Our Smith evidence and as well as the Tuck and Yang evidence indicate that we are only able to have a violent revolution against the state as long as we stop framing it as a hermeneutic.
Okay. In this violent revolution, how do you beat the U.S. military, which is the best in the world?
I'm sorry, what?
So this is just getting like OD nationalist. I don't understand.
I-
like you're like, well,
I
actually, the
just
United
don't
States is
understand.
best,
I
and,
understand
like,
the
you're never
root
gonna
cause
do
claim
that.
you've made.
Are we
I do
gonna
not
have a
understand
campaign?
how you do anything to then
So it's
resolve
a
the
bit-
wider
Hold on, hold on
problem.
for a second. This is the problem. You're talking about this like very theoretically. This is
I'm,
not
I've tried to get to
theoretical.
specifics.
You're
Namely,
talking-
what you do about the CO2 that's going into the atmosphere.
You were talking about, you've just asked a question about the US military that acts as if like Native and Black people who are literally fighting anti-colonial fights as we speak, like are not already being
But
killed
your
by the
method,
military.
your
Like,
method
the
of
fuck-
getting rid of the United States is a violent revolution, is what you have said.
Yeah, it's consistent
Okay.
with Fanon. Tuck and Yang
there-
are reading
okay.
Fanon.
I want to go to the very top of the 2NC. You said that one of the reasons why the alternative is better is because it has kinetic energy.
Mhm.
How much kinetic energy is enough to solve? Or how does the judge measure which team
I
had
don't know,
more?
but y'all didn't move around at all, so that's what you got.
Was that enough kinetic energy?
Can you
We've been
please
moving.
not, can you
We didn't
please
dance.
not diminish the scholarship that's involved?
So
Because
how
Khalil
do we
does
measure
dance,
which
and
team
it
had
does
more
matter.
kinetic energy or how much is enough?
I don't
How do we know if
I
that's a
don't know why
solvency
white people
deficit
are
to one
constantly
team?
so preoccupied with measuring everything, but no, we do not have a measure.
if you did, you didn't affirm anything.
Y'all didn't do it. That seems like a measure to me.
Alright. Good? Cool. Alright.
Just transfer it down.
Yeah, sure.
The all-destructive cellular colonial structure which has produced these climate conditions in the first place. The app is not unique. We have had several energy topics and a bunch of teams running app against apps even on non-energy detail debate topics. The benefit of these debates are inevitable. We don't need the affirmative. They are not unique because the government has already passed several laws to solve global warming. Even if the plan is more effective, it's not necessary to spur political action, or the political action is inevitable now. No internal link to Native and Black death. Natives and Black people don't die because of global warming. They die because of genocide, enslavement, and colonization. Our alternative solves global warming. The root cause is colonization and the denial of spiritual relationship with the land. Only the alternative can reformulate our relationship to the land. Global warming is inevitable. It's too fast, and the atmosphere is saturated with greenhouse gases. Online gambling can't solve for it quick enough. 2 reasons: GOP will never get on board, and oil companies will block solvency, and China and India will never get on board. No modeling solvency. Third world emissions overwhelm plan. No solvency. No internal link because the plan the plan in the advantage is fiat is not real, so plan never happens. Their legal education and discourse can't recreate the change that they need in time. Vote negative on presumption, the fact that they don't do shit, and at least a decolonial attitude and decolonial structure will actually solve for the shit that's causing global warming in the first place. The 1AC performance uses dance and solarized insights a critique of the cellular colonial structure and global warming. November 14. Majority of U.S. policy, even though it's promising on the surface, has often been used to manipulate Native people to affirm land loss, and has also been used best symbolic in its assertion for Native rights, which the capitalist exploitation enslaved some Native people in their lands. There remains a persistent reliance on the fiduciary relationship with the federal government is integral to such exploitation in the first place. Lands are taken and polluted by establishment of the war guardian relationship. Solar Rise artistically and expressively underscores how fiduciary relationship operates on the capitalist neo-colonial logic that allows for symbolic justice, now no real change in terms of land ethics and relationship between Indian County and the U.S. government. So Rise also incites a critique of settler state that feels it can absolve itself of its wrongdoing with money legislation and legitimizes its theft and pollution of the earth. Our land ethic is a prerequisite to solving global warming. Number 14. The world is desperately in need of a clear and developed land ethic, and we have to shift away from the current demise of the environment. And if we are to continue to contest the settler colonial capitalist approach to land management, what does Native feminist lens bring to the discussion of land ethics? How does Native feminist land ethic push beyond contestation of conservation and protection to consider more liberating terms of what living in the land rather than over the land? How does Native feminist and land ethic change management strategies that are bound in the law? The environment of Native feminist land ethic would actually be the one that's against the law rather than the one that continues to demand recognition from the federal government to uphold the law. Native feminist analytic primary aim is to disrupt settler colonialist logic and force ideological decolonial reorientation to move beyond the reliance on the settler state to build a relationship out of respect with the land. A Native feminist land ethic challenges all of us to build alliances across Native and non-Native communities and to enact a radical relationality with the land, transcends the settler state's power and process of recognition and legitimization. Due to the history of land being incredibly gendered as male as female and thus seen as penetrable, rapeable, and ultimately in need of domination, the native feminist land ethic challenges the sexist discrimination grafted onto land through settler colonialism. Extend my dance. Actually, hold off on a second. In what world are Native nations growing a fast-growing population? No concept of depth. They have no concept of depth that people of color go through. Warming won't soften the imminent threats of the imminent deaths of people of color face every fucking day. They say they care about deaths in Africa and India, but don't really talk about the 7,000 women that died from birth complications from lack of medical care due to colonization in Africa. Warming won't remedy the positionality of these people of color, and certainly doesn't solve for the degradation of the land that happens because of colonialism, which they agree is the problem. But because they aren't affected by colonialism directly, they don't fucking care. They only care about warming because white people are tied up in this idea of world extinction. When white people stand to die, of course we want to solve for the holistic problem, but we don't solve for the fact that millions of people are still going to die regardless because colonialism deems these lands fungible and the people within those lands is fungible. And what lands are deemed fungible? Lands that people of color inhabit. I can't literally reiterate this enough. The neg disrupts colonialism ties to and creates mobility. They have no form of mobilization. What the fuck is their plan? Just because you say the government should do something doesn't mean the government will do something. The movement is fucking needed, and an alternative is a form of social mobility that engages us and allows us to disrupt this space and also allows us to challenge and deconstruct this structure of colonialism that's embedded in the USF fucking G. Extend my dance is the reason to vote for Vermont for several reasons. Kinetic energy is key to resistance. The one to see actually it's key to deconstruction. The one to see dance reminds us of all of this, the important work we must do to decolonize. Reading poetry or just simply stating a policy plan will not get people to move. The dance is protest of settler innocence. These are demonic grounds that you walk on, that you and I walk on every day, and I choose to dance on. Dance connects us to the land and reminds us of the collective colonial past. Hip hop can be a part of Black Native and Native Land Coalition. The one to see song was a Native Black collaboration centered around decolonization, cross-applied, and our Navarro evidence is very clear on this. The permutation cannot solve decolonization. It's a distinct project that is also discursive. You cannot solve for decolonization if you don't really see the problems with it, and they have yet, and they're over here saying that, okay, Native populations are increasing. The U.S. military is the greatest military in the world. Like, literally, hegemony is good now? What the fuck? You're only promoting more deaths of people of color. You don't really care about the deaths of people of color when you're sitting here saying, okay, warming stands to kill us all, but you only want to live so that you can further subjugate those people of color in the fucking first place. The permutation attempts to include us without decolonization, that's violent. You can't ask me to engage in a complicity of furthering colonization.
Cool. We have 7:40. 49. Yeah, like I didn't do anything more. This should be good. Maybe like 1 minute. Yeah, no, I got it. Yeah.
Can I get the Smith card back?
Alright. 317. Do you have it written out?
Yeah. It is just.
I need to pee. Can I do that now?
So I'm going to start with like the case arguments that were in the 1 NR. Sort of like about the app, and then it'll be like the case straight down. I'll be clear about where. Okay. The app is sufficient to solve warming to internal limits, conceded the plan puts us in compliance with WTO rules, which means the country complies with WTO IP innovation rules. They've conceded the modeling claims that indicate that prohibition crushes renewable tech development with other countries, which solve their China argument. Second is LNG regulations. Prohibition commits the U.S. to haul out LNG export rights, which makes explosions to huge methane releases in inevitable status quo, makes a triad for the app because that prevents extinction of the human race. That's the wrong evidence. This answers their claims about GOP and oil companies because it ensures that the U.S. makes a domestic shift through renewable technology, and also means that our internal links sufficient. Their claims about FIA not being real and the plan never having our questions of framework. They have no offensive reason why we should not be able to debate the hypothetical enactments of the app will be later on the framework to debate the argument about the app's dialogue not being non-unique. Things like the energy topic and non-energy debate topics are obviously laughable, not a question of how long we debated. Our argument is just that our process of skills building and incorporating those conversations into public policy are productive and useful for us, but they don't have any offensive reason why we can't debate hypothetical enactment. It's not unique because the government's already passed laws, because we have not made a massive. It's not non-unique because we haven't made a massive shift in terms of renewable technology. The app is obviously key to. The framework debate, the role of the balance to simulate the enactment of the plan. That's key to developing portable skills that empirically can be used to better effectuate any goal. Debates over legalization are a heuristic for approaches to activism policy that are inherently reflexive and subject to refinement, but only if we engage in thought experiments. We have a vision for how our education informs the space. That's the entirety of our second contention. It indicates that our process of skill building is good, which means that there's no reason to vote negative on presumption. But regardless, they have no offensive reason why we should not evaluate the hypothetical enactment of the 1EC after the block, which is a really big deal because a lot of their offense is predicated on the notion that the app does not result in anything, whereas they have no contestation of the fact that legalization is sufficient to solve. It also does not solve pragmatism because it's not assess viability. They're tucking evidence. It does not assume the fact that the law is accessible and open to revision. That's the Heatrick evidence. Legal education is good and malleable, which is linked deep into the K. That's Musida. It's open and revisable. Allows us to take institutional and educational practices. Abandoning the law means right-wing takeover, which co-opts the alternative. Institutions are inevitable, but the app is key to engage with them. Now, the impact debate. Warming outweighs and turns the K. It causes massive suffering in the short term and structural impacts of hunger, resource shortage, and sea level rise. Those affect poor and marginalized communities more in turn the impact. Now, CO2 is the root cause of warming. Ice core data, quantitative data, consistent scientific studies prove our epistemology is rigorously tested. Historical land ethics do not explain why industrial society continues to pollute. Root cause does not equal solvency because they do not have an alternative claim to solve. That was explicit in the cross-sex. Death is also the end of possibility of reversing violent social relations. Islands are disappearing and glaciers are melting. Quick policy solutions before the tipping point prove that the app's key. That's the correct evidence. History is also not a complete politics. Having right there of where we are gets them to the table, but it does not establish how to evaluate impact or solve debate. With the app's key to, there's also no terminal impact explained in the block. No colonial lines. Now, trend lines are improving for First Americans, which is a function of policy-based progress, which proves that the app's engagement with institutions is productive. That's Gawkins. We are obviously not saying that things are perfect now or good. A couple of schools are good are sufficiently solve the problem, but that policy readers has a positive effect. Their argument and their impact about settler colonialism do not access root cause claims. Warming exacerbates settler colonialism worse because it locks in elite power over marginalized communities. We do not domesticate the black struggle or relegate Africa on ecological property. There is no link to these arguments explained in the block, which means you should have a high threshold for the link argument. They also have no link evidence that we relegate Native people to minority. All these arguments are just assertions and not tied to any part of the intrinsic to the app. We can permute them away. Now, climate change is a disproportionate impact on tribal lands, returns the app, returns the K, broader and level tribal lands, particularly for buffalo, other streams, tries to disproportionate climate change studies, numerous extreme events, as a particular dimension, damage effects, lives of Native Americans, the use of some movements, damage of other effects in the United States history. Now, the alternative debate, frame all their solvency claims through the global evidence. Their movements outside of law get co-opted and run over by conservative forces. That's the global evidence. They're a form of moot activism that doesn't come to grips with the institutions and scope, and the only way to solve warming, their kinetic energy argument, material movement of the body does not spill over. They have no offensive reason why we can't imagine the hypothetical of the 1EC which solves warming, but no explanation as to how their individual politics solves it. It does not turn illegal education because that was only on the framework debate. It's the only way to motivate action in climate change. No, environmental destruction collapses the alt. We can't resist these forms of settler colonialism if we're all dead from climate change. It causes displacement and makes organization possible. There's also a climate deed. They move outside the law, crosses climate activism. State-based solutions are key. That's the CEG per evidence. They need to spell out how they solve warming, how they develop effective green tech, and how they transition away from industrial society. Otherwise, it's all triggered by the status quo. Their argument about dances to solarize global warming, how their land ethics solves are really moot. They don't have no connection to how they solve that. Warming disproportionately affects people in color. 7,000 people died from lack of birth. That's the Burkhead evidence. The alternative plan does not solve mobilization because the alt is not a form of social mobility. Do not spill outside of this place. Dance is not a sufficient reason why they've conceded the Rothkopf evidence that says that individual performance and aesthetics do not spill over outside of this place and trade off with broader collective action, which is critical to solve warming. Their revolution fails. Rothkopf in 13 hopes revolution turn first century just occupy which no one's willing to change the least of the money military and please make the political expression. They can use their sneak to press on people. They can display revolution advance or an agenda for selling reasons part of the sludge, especially movements like the agenda, strong political organization, plans for shining their vows. The performance argument, it fails. It trades off with broader collective action. That's the key to Padilla evidence. Subjectivity means it's not spill over into a broader movement. Now the permutation debate, all the links about the quo. You need to have a link to the plan, not just an area. Institutions like the WTO are inevitable, which makes their impacts inevitable. That's only a question of effective engagement. Permutation, new plan, engaging in the method of decolonization. its most realistic solution that incorporates criticism of the state with the solution to climate change. Hudson takes out the impact to the cave. It proves that policy changes can reverse anti-blackness because it's material, ontic, and not ontological. It's not about framing of exclusion. The WTO link. WTO is good in this instance. The alternative is fair born policies that exacerbate structural violence. Also, the WTO solves all their impacts. The gradient 2K, Washington temperature, natural globalization, is corporate by form, holding the rules, big solution be the form, the big rules, big constructions, small ones. Do you think Australia could have such a long WTO is always much better than the alternative law of jungle velocity? But companies who would be reluctant to invest in developing countries if there were no real trade barriers would creep by the one by explaining to hostile regional blocks developing countries who join on unfavorable terms to be left out. There would be much less need for more people trapped in poverty, even longer east African gains, even the poorest. Finally, the Western knowledge arguments don't default to their retreat from questions about solvency. It's not reconciliation. If the alt is not a productive form of politics in the context of warming, that's a reason to vote affirmative. Tuck and Yang advocate a bad form of politics. Their evidence ignores consequences, which fundamentally makes the alt a reaffirmation of the status quo. The alt separation of Western institutional knowledge from indigenous knowledge is a bad form of politics that bankrupts decall. That's the fifth evidence. It results in violent nationalism and excludes it from broader political dialogue that's key to solve warming. The impact on their argument, they're not sufficient to solve this. They're not sufficient to solve warming because they don't result in broader coalition. The alt is separate politics that results in ethnographic discourse that perpetuates their us-them dichotomy, perpetuates Eurocentric thinking that defines the Native American as the other. The absent injection of institutional thinking gets their politics off the ground. That's the Peters evidence. Now, finally, the permutation comes how we can't synthesize. Permutation is a workable strategy because it does not purport to incorporate the performance of the 1AC as a form of productive labor, but rather it's an argument why they're not incommensurable in the first place. Their politics incommensurability assumes that we should not be able to debate the pragmatic outcomes of the alternative versus the app. All of our solvency claims are reasons why the app institutional form of knowledge are good.
Yes. Sorry. Oh, could we get our evidence back, please?
Yep.
a game of chicken on who's going to lights. And claim to them that I legally know somebody needs to make a decision. Well, it's just tragic. Yeah.
Understand it as a dance because that makes the most fucking sense because revolution is a spatial praxis or which they don't have an answer to. Our second argument is the land ethic. We read 3 Navarro evidence and there is not the word land in the 1AR, which reveals that they are already tied up in a spatial dislocation of settler colonialism. They can fundamentally never grapple with the relationality of the land. We are a radical reorientation of relationship to the land through the dance of the 1AC and through playing the song Solarize, which we are specifically talking about as a form of decolonization that rejects the legal praxis that they are attempting to advocate for. It also indicates that we have to have a native feminist land ethic, which is key to intervene into settler colonial discourses that commodify native and black bodies and lands. Their legal analysis is always going to fail because native and black people are presumed to be because it preserves the United States as the ward of the land and ultimately as the ward of our bodies so that both can appear fungible and become fungible within the 1AC. That means that the affirmative is just locked into the status quo, that the affirmative is just more of the same. That's also the piece of Smith evidence that indicates that they hermeneutically seal the state because as in the 1AC, the only way that we can ever assess how liberated we are is to assess what policies the government has implemented to attempt to progress us, but this has just secured the violence of the this secures the state as a hermeneutic, and it leads to those 3 impact arguments that I go for. Domestication of blacks to the erasure and internalization and minoritization of indigenous peoples, and 3, that it hermeneutically seals the state, which means that there can never be some type of transnational anti-colonial movement capable of challenging it. They also are fundamentally mishandling the 1NR in the context of this. Even if we don't win a root cause claim, there are still clear environmental benefits to a native feminist land ethic that ultimately rejects the law. They have to be answering the pieces of Navarro evidence in order to be getting at this question, but also, in addition, they aren't handling 3 important bullet points. The first one I address above is that we have had several energy topics. There are lots of people debating about warming. You need to have a reason why your affirmative itself is unique in this context because obviously warming is still something that's going on. People have been debating about it for OD long, but secondly, you are literally not answering, dropping completely that the government has already passed several laws to attempt to solve global warming, which means that you need to defend your policy approach specifically. You say you have some internal link arguments, but a lot of people who have passed policies have some internal link arguments as to how those policies are going to solve, but there is history, unfortunately, is not on your side on this one. It also the flip side of that is that means that so either the AF fundamentally cannot solve, or that political action is already inevitable now, which means that the status quo can overcome the affirmative, so it's not inherent, and you should vote nay on presumption. But third, that they have no internal link to native and black death, because native and black people are not only dying from warming. This is a critical concession and a framing argument. It indicates that our impact is always going to outweigh, because colonialism are proportionately huger impacts than fucking warming. In addition to that, the 1AR also drops that gambling is not going to be able to solve, 1, because the GOP is not going to be for it, and 2, because oil companies are going to block any anti-warming legislation, which means that they definitely can't solve. Other emissions are also going to overwhelm. This means that if they can't fundamentally solve the affirmative, then we at least have some defense to the affirmative. Any argument about the 1AR. Next, you should prefer the reason the ethic of incommensurability. That's the Tuck and Yang evidence that indicates that this project is always going to be unsettling, that it doesn't protect the status quo or settler futurity. We don't need to answer questions for decolonization to exist as a framework. This is literally what Tuck and Yang are saying. They have already assumed your arguments, but it is not the other way around. You have also conceded that we've articulated that black and red nationalism is good because it's the only way that we can have a violent insurrection against the nation state. If that is the case, then the fact that we spur nationalism probably is a solvency argument for us. That's also consistent with the piece of Smith evidence where she's talking about the transnational character of resistance. Now to the perm. The perm merely treats decolonization as an empty signifier. There is not a good answer to this argument. You have just appropriated this word for your legal education about other social justice projects, which is exactly what Tuck and Yang are talking about. They literally say decolonization cannot be easily grafted onto pre-existing discourses and frameworks, even if they are critical, even if they are anti-racist, even if they are justice frameworks. The easy absorption, adoption, and transposing of decolonization is yet another form of settler appropriation, which means that you are just appropriating things that locks you into the status quo. That's exactly what Tuck and Yang are fucking saying. You also try to answer the argument that I make, that you make Khalil fungible and use his productive labor, but you don't effectively answer this argument because you just say that you want the two things to coexist, but you don't have a coherent articulation of the perm. You also probably should have went to the permutation first. This is a reason why you should vote for decolonization alone and not the permutation, because fundamentally we are winning that our method is better, and we are winning link arguments that suggest that these methods are fundamentally incommensurable, which means that you cannot enact a project of decolonization alongside the violent colonial education that the 1AC is engaged in.
How much do we have?
317.
You're good at all.
Yeah.
Warming policies that we can then link to the nitty-gritty, figure out why those policies have not yet worked and how we can improve them. We have defense of how that works. The alternative is not able to solve. There are two big reasons. One is that they do not use the state aid. That they do not lead to broader change in consumption practices or emissions. Personal change in emissions are not even productive, counterproductive. So they decrease those large parts of the project with the CHE evidence questioning the underlying structures is not sufficient as apprentice evidence. B, their movements get co-opted to are denied of any response to the Roth Capital Global evidence. Global says that their extra legal challenges to the state do not lead to change. Instead, the states more likely lead to co-option and influx of conservatives into the government, into public opposite into the courts of seriously ramp up and depression after the alternative. Heat evidence and Matsuda evidence says you cannot just wish the law away because it structures around society. The Roth Capital evidence says that your revolution is which is what the 2NC cross-sex endorses. Their alternative is doomed to fail because you cannot overcome the entrenched leader with the most money, have the biggest military in the world, etc. You cannot change the state. The second big reason is that they do not use sexy. Weaver evidence says that this is a non-scientific person approach of the person approach misdiagnosis the problem form because the everyday looking just at the everyday very visible weather events is not sufficient to understand the phenomenon for. You need rigorous scientific testing. Berkman evidence says that the use of scientific empiricism is the key solution to one because it is a scientific phenomenon. Now the turns case arguments the evidence it is not even talk about global warming, talk about climate change. It just talks about how about climate change. It says that says that the importance to increase the relationship with your Fed. It's not not relevant to affecting the emissions, etc. Mind term links to prove that even if we commodify the earth, even if we commodify the earth, we can still result from emissions going to the atmosphere. Also, the root cause comes to appear denied because we've had a control plan to combat the commodified resources for thousands of years. We've only had warming for the past about 100 years because the actual cause of it is fossil fuels, not just using the land, using the land generally. Even if they have a deeper root cause, we still have a proximate cause that the affirmative is able to resolve. Root causes are about the root causes of bad politics. You can't actually falsify them in. It does not lead to an effective solution. The framework. The two minorities conceded our interpretation that the role of the ballot should be disseminated the enactment of the plan. They have no argument as to why we shouldn't evaluate the hypothetical of the 1C, even if they win. The fact that we've debated about energy politics before, non-unique C, as well proclaims the plan leads to an incredibly large shift of renewables involvement and prevents methane released to which trigger global warming impacts. Our argument is not that debating about the climate science, that the debates we suddenly solve, we uniquely improve our understanding of climate issues and nuances of everything we develop and we debate. And those, this goes to a perfectly effectuated goal that also allows a more informed sense of the climate issue, which also the misinformation and the status quo. The balance malleable debate about changes institutional educational practices. It's a huge evidence, but pseudo evidence says that there's simulation of government action that allows us the forms of legal education, so we can alter those broader structures. So this individual debate does have a variety that can affect those broader structures. At the very least, though, the plan is a good idea that they have not answered, which is sufficient to vote on the sufficient vote affirmative. The Smith evidence says that the government is sealed from threats. It's not saying sealed from a reform. Our whole argument is that with a broader legal education, we can subvert those larger structures. We don't look at what the government has done and hold it up. We say what the government can do, because the whole one exceeds the criticism of current government policy. We also have impact defense. The impact defense their evidence. The gap evidence says there's not currently a genocide happening against the native peoples. Even though the colonial system is still messed up, then it does not reach the same magnitude as global warming. Also, that's an evidence that the system blackness is not ontological or that's because you can endorse a broader structures, to be able to alter, to be able to reduce that violence. It's also not something that's enough. The permutation is functionally linked in impact defense. We can't solve all this. There's some other things that we have not made excuse so that we can stop the funding plans versus black in names and also try to address global warming. We can also play the song Soul Rise and endorse a land form to reduce the amount of stress that's on the environment, which doesn't mean you vote next.
I'm good with the debate.
Good debate.
decision. Is it here? The decision is a 3-0 decision for the negative from Vermont.
I'll go first. I weighed this round through an impact calc versus solvency debate to see how I should evaluate try or dies. And so I kind of posed the meta question of, is it a try or die for the decall alts with kinetic energy as the method, even if the state is inevitable, and even if the state might be key to solve warming? I concluded maybe it is worth it to take a leap of faith, which might hopefully resolve a lot of the questions you may have about various parts of the act that you're extending.
Yeah, I also try to use that sort of framing to understand the impacts. Well, the first thing I do is sort of set up a frame for decision making, i.e. I will vote if versus I will vote neg if. And I conclude that the central thesis of the debate is, do the benefits of advocating for legalization of online gambling outweigh the benefits of affirming a decolonialism movement? I'll talk about the permutations sort of at the end, because I think they do when it's competitive, so it becomes sort of that forced choice. And I suppose so that being the central thesis, what are the benefits of voting affirmative? The 2AR goes for warming, obviously, and I think you win to some extent. It's coming, and it's bad, and you do win that. I mean, not to some extent you do. However, I'm not convinced the app can solve global warming versus the root cause claim, which I'll address. The second thing is I'm not even really sure you really handle some of these analytical arguments that well. Just like the GOP and oil and gas companies will block renewables, you say like we solve LNG, which makes renewables cheaper, but I don't think you're ever makes an argument like the GOP would be cool with regulating natural gas emissions, just that we need more forceful emissions and we need to make sure they're effective on methane. Or that subsidizing renewables in the short term would happen with Congress or anything like that. I think you kind of blow off these arguments a little bit because they're analytical, and I don't think they take out 100% of the 1AC by any means, but they do minimize solvency to some extent. And I think just as big of a hit to your solvency as some of these solvency arguments you go for against the alts, which are like you can't solve because hedge stops a revolution, or the kinetic energy arguments that you kind of extend briefly. So it's not 100% solvency for the app. It's mitigated solvency, and it's probably the alt. Is probably less mitigated to that degree. Oh, there's also an argument from you all that like IP protections are key to tech innovations, but just again implementation questions. It seems are like ignored on how that would get implemented, how that renewable strategy gets implemented. So it's not 100% risk of app solvency by any means, and. While I agree with the affirmative to some extent that there's some short-term impacts and why we might need a political strategy in the short term, I'm unsure how to address sort of the long-term questions of why colonialism will continue to create the conditions that cause climate change and environmental impacts otherwise. And I'm sort of unsure how to weigh if I think that climate impacts are a byproduct of colonialism, so the two are inevitably tied together, and maybe the alt doesn't solve a short-term instance. How do I weigh that short-term impact versus the fact that it's almost try or die now for the alt because of the root cause claim, because of the inevitability claim, and with an external impact of colonialism, because the app doesn't really have anything external in this debate to weigh against the alt, because the app has warming and the neg's turning that. The neg does have a colonialism sort of external question, so they do have that. But how do you weigh sort of the short-term impacts? And here's where you could have spent some more time doing impact calculus on why short-term comes first. Ethics don't matter. If we're all dead, you only die once. Maybe type framing, try to get the ethos back and that side a little bit, but I think the negative is ahead on some of the just like ethos questions of ethics and colonialism being bad, and sort of a prior question and structure conditions for environmental catastrophe inevitably, and sort of flipping back that whole try or die question back on the alternative, sort of like how Richard said. Just a couple things at the bottom. I never really understood the science argument. I think this is maybe something you could have jettisoned for time on the permutation. I think I can agree that CO2 is bad, but also think that a decolonial struggle is the best way to deal with warming. So really, if there was a distinction there, I thought maybe you needed to phrase it out a little bit. And the perm I alluded to earlier, I'm not sure the 2AR gets here with enough time left to answer some of the link debate. I'm not really sure how I can reconcile engaging the state as a useful heuristic and a decolonization movement. If maybe you want to frame the app as sort of an endorsement of the plan text in a vacuum and not necessarily the endorsements of the heuristic sort of page, I think you have to do a little bit more work investing in that earlier in the debate, and certainly in the 2AR, and also sort of the like co-option arguments I don't think the 2AR gets to, and if you did, I just didn't understand them. So yeah, I almost think it's more try or die for the alt, external impact being the colonialism stuff, and I think that their alt solvency is higher than the half solvency. Maybe not on the short-term one, but on the long-term one, then I'm not sure how to weigh why does short-term matter versus long-term.
Yeah, I agree with much of that. I think part of the problem is you get caught up in your own arguments, and I mean, some of the arguments they're making are not all that developed, but they're not really, you don't make any effort to answer them at all, which is kind of problematic on a couple of core levels. I think the place in the debate where you are the furthest behind is the permutation debate. Their argument says that to the incommensurability, and that the advocacy of the affirmative is an act of colonial settlerism. I don't think you have very good answers to. You're just kind of play this game that we help those people kind of as through our colonial settler actions of technology to find these solutions. We'll save them with the savior mentality, which they argue is an independent link, and the notion that it's not logically incommensurable that you can dance and play songs and engage in advocacy for technological changes, but that their evidence is very good, I think, on the question of whether or not the advocacy, the affirmative's approach to the problems are engaged in settler colonialism. And the place I think the negative is winning, that the method that you have endorsed or that you've asked me to endorse in the debate is an unethical methodology. And I think this is a place where the negative could be a lot stronger and talk about the ethics of the settler colonialism. But the 2NR does make these 3 independent impact claims of colonizing Africa and controlling it, and the ongoing deaths of indigenous people that are not affected by embracing the colonialist mentality. And while there's no evidence to support those claims, and they're not really very well developed or impacted, I don't think there's any answer to those at all. So the question is whether or not colonialism is something, is an unethical method. I don't think is questioned. What you're attempting to go for is the global warming outweighs kind of argument. And I think the problem with this is they're right that you're legalizing gambling, and your link to the warming stuff is, you could be a lot better on the defensive arguments you're making, but the argument, your only solvency mechanism is new technologies, and they make the argument that oil companies would try to prevent those from being used. Your LNG as an argument is just warming will happen faster if we do more LNG, not that's not a solvency for warming kind of notion. So your only real solvency mechanism for solving the inevitable warming that exists in the status quo is hoping that if they get some patents, maybe those oil companies will distribute them globally to try and solve, whereas they have vested economic interests in not necessarily doing that. And I think those arguments could be a lot better developed. I think you're going for a little bit the wrong arguments in the 2NR of we've done plans in the past on warming that weren't effective. Those arguments don't get you anywhere, and to some extent seem kind of dangerous to me because they implicate the uniqueness that settler colonialism is inevitable because policies will be ongoing and other kinds of things. But I don't think those arguments were getting you anywhere. But the arguments as to why the argument that the plan did legalize gambling and then hoped that would lead to some kind of aspect of climate change and more warranted reasons as to why those specific challenges wouldn't work is problematic. I think the app does, the strongest part of your arguments are arguments as to why it is that the alt won't solve either because it'll be co-opted, which leaves me kind of in a position that I'm highly skeptical that warming gets solved in either kind of scenario. But I think that they win their argument is that their methodological approach to trying to solve it is a more ethical methodology. So endorsing a kinetic effort to try and disconnect ourselves from settler colonialism, even though I suspect that it would never work, is better than engaging in a repeat of a settler colonialist method to try and solve warming that I don't think is likely to solve it.
I think if you all had a stronger defensive like an ethic, just like what Dr. Harris is talking about, like maybe just defend the position, obviously assuming that the negative will continue to defend their position that like modernity and enlightenment are bad, to just like hold the wall on enlightenment, like Western thinking good, you know, that makes it a lot easier in my opinion to make most of the critique go away if you can persuade your judges that that way of viewing the world is better, because it's just a debate about world interps, but your defense of your world interp, I guess, is complicated if you don't have a stronger meta defense of your theory.
Okay. Do you mean sort of like defensive science? And I assume in the context of warming.
Right, not like
yeah.
Yes, in the context of warming, but also like the bigger picture of like enlightenment thinking and like modernity, because otherwise the thesis of the neg critique makes all of your arguments go away. If you say science good, they'll say what, like, beg the question of what is science. You know, you say like what is the solvency, they'll say it begs the question of why do we need to solve. They're just critiquing everything in the context of enlightenment thinking. You have to defend things like rationality, instrumentality, like, you know, the 2EC have bits and pieces of it. Util, you know, that's like a very like enlightenment way of thinking. You know, you have a defense of your world interp. Those are the kind of arguments you need to be able to push back against like the negative position that wishes away your entire case.
Yeah. So I guess permutation. Totally agree. Toyara didn't have a lot of time on it. I guess I didn't think the perm was incredibly useful, especially when like y'all is like destroy the U.S. decoloniality. Do you think there was a lot more utility I could get out of the perm?
But I think earlier in the debate there was. I think late in the debate you're right, there's not.
Okay. So should the Toyara just jettison perm entirely, and then, or was the problem that we didn't push harder on the perm in like 1AR, or?
I don't know if Dr. Harris would agree with this, but by the time the 2AR came along, when you had 20 seconds left and extended the perm, I would have to spend that time on the solvency part of the debate.
Yeah.
But in question of like the 1AR and the 2AC big picture thing, I think the permutation is useful. I think that it can deal with some of the link arguments, it can deal with maybe some of the external questions of colonialism as an impact outside of the warming debate that you just want to stay focused on. I think you might have to deal with, like, heuristic means you always link. You said it was a useful heuristic for engagement, that's a link. You might have to deal with like WTO equals a link. You said it was good, so that's always a link. You know, dealing with that, maybe having a framing of the plan text as a stasis point to engage competition or something like that, to get out of maybe some of those rhetoric sort of, or what your advocacy is, sort of links, then it becomes more helpful. But what the time you spent on it in the 2AR was totally much better off than on solvency or impacting short time frame of solvency.
Yeah, and I thought there were some other places where maybe you could have generated some offensive arguments. So, for example, if you frame the if you frame the inevitability of the WTO as a mechanism for settler colonialism, and collapse of it would be worse, you read those cards in the 1AR, because it would unleash even more settler colonialist domination, because the WTO is a constraint that allows. So if your advocacy is that the U.S. should comply with the demands of the other and the way in which we approach it, maybe framed some way in which that generates offense for you, because they don't make an answer to your WTO cards that are read in the 1AR. Some other places where, it seemed like there were some places that the 2NR wasn't answering some of the things that you did in the 1AR that you could have generated more offense out of. Or not just that the revolution doesn't work, but the backlash arguments, that it leads to more domination and more, a lot of that offense, the 2NR ends up being just all about climate outweighs and then is defense, largely on decay. And there's not an effort to generate offensive places to, and I think instead of going for the permanent 2AR, that would have been more useful kinds of ways to, where do I generate independent offense for us outside of just warming out waves.
Yes. Do you think 2AR needs more independent offense because of just like the case defense arguments, or is there another reason?
Well, I mean, one way to generate offense is to do more of the why is it that your solvency is better than theirs, and making those comparative kind of, I mean, that's one of the places where you have to, I mean, since that's the offense you're going for, that is a distinction that you need to be spending more time on. So, I mean, that would be the first place. I was just suggesting there may be, I mean, you always want more offense.
Yeah. Okay. So you think sort of defense put against the alt is not, if not equal to, it's sort of comparable to the defense that is put on like case solvency for warming?
Well, yours is a little more developed because you read cards and they just made some analytics. So yeah, yours is more developed, but I mean, you don't answer there. So, and theirs makes a lot of intuitive sense to me.
Yeah. Do you think the 1AR dropped that argument then? Or is it? Again,
maybe less so
1AR definitely
technical
didn't
drop than like not persuasive.
Yeah, I would
That's,
say
I
it was
think,
a drop.
It's not
Okay.
a technical flow. It's, I don't know what the answer is
Okay.
that effectively makes it go away for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Something you said earlier, actually, first off, hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to
Very
meet you.
nice to finally be judged by you. But on this whole, okay, even if like their solvency is better than ours, where do you stand on this whole, like the ethics of our method?
I think in a world, I think you need to develop that argument more. I think that's an argument that you can, even if you lose the way solvency is to what it solves. I think you're way underdeveloping that argument in this debate and not making enough use of it. Because I mean, largely the word ethic comes out of your mouths as the ethic of incoherence, just the ethic of incompatibility, which is more a link to why the perm can't happen rather than ethics as an autonomous impact. And I thought there were some places that you had opportunities to exploit more, like when you're mocking them initially for saying, gee, the indigenous people should be grateful because they had some schools built. I think those are arguments you don't want to let go away in debates. You want to keep pressing the envelope on anytime they've got those kinds of things going that are indicative of why the entire mindset that they have of, you know, we decided to exploit the land and exploit the people, and now let's continue exploitation. And the mechanism for doing that is to patent to protect patent rights, to be able to allow our companies to go into other countries and take their plants and treat them as resources. That resource link that you made initially, I thought was a great argument, and that disappears, and that becomes a link for their patent process inherently treats those things as resources. Their method, which the notion of those, I mean, if the water and the plants are part of the heart and that interconnection that you make, the method that they're arguing we should solve warming is to patent those plants. That's problematic.
On the lines of letting arguments go, if you're going to take the performance method to the alt, maybe you can also garner a performance link. Like, I remember in the cross-ex, there was a weird, kind of in my opinion, awkward moment when I believe the 2A had asked you, you know, what about the military? And you're like, well, see, that's a link. Or then he asks, like, is this kinetic energy? And you're like, now you're just making fun of our arguments and meaning it. Those are like performance links that are like hanging out there.
And don't back down on that stuff with why are white people trying to quantify things. I mean, the notion that people laughed at Gandhi as an idea that he could stand up. People laughed at standing in front of a tank in China. I mean, the notion that embodied protests are meaningless use of kinetic energy, and the more useful use of kinetic energy is simply to lobby members of our legislature. I think you might, I mean, their dance notion, their kinetic energy evidence is kind of about, is not exclusively limited to dance, and I think there might be ways that you could argue that there are all kinds of forms of productive kinetics that could be engaged in, that lobbying Congress is an exercise in kinetic, that engaging in advocacy in the debate space is kinetic activity, that dance, performative dance isn't the only use of energy.
The question got executed wrong. It wasn't the
I
kinetic.
feel that way.
It has to be the what is not kinetic. To like start figuring out like
Yeah, and the military thing I think just got weird because I think your question is how do you overcome the military?
Yeah,
not
I didn't
endorse
mean it to be
military.
like,
It's like
oh,
a phrase
right
now
really
you're saying
over and
hedge
over.
Yeah,
because
I
that's
spent
what
like,
you're-
it's really big, they have a lot of guns.
Yeah, that wasn't,
Yeah.
how do you overcome the military? I
Yeah.
think was the question rather than, and then you were like, what?
Yeah,
The
wording
military's
could have been
good? Now we're hedge.
Yeah.
Future discussions, I think, especially preparation, should packaging, like especially cross-sector questions.
Yeah.
So, same with y'all. Like, for an ARG that relies so much on authenticity testing, you know, like how you authenticity tested the 2EC concepts on kinetic energy, like it's kind of weird for me. It like kind of like breaks down a little bit when you engage in like, in my opinion, colonial rhetoric of its own. When you say like warming's inevitable because of the third world, it seems like such a simplistic phrase that like needs more unpacking. I will say I have that float on my flow.
Please.
I don't know
I
mine.
never said that.
I've never said that.
I'm not gonna have a debate about whether or not you said it, but just like that kind of rhetoric you should be cautious about it. Is that a fair compromise?
I'm very conscious, but I don't believe I said it.
Fair enough.
Whatever. I didn't say it.
If you want to start a controversy about that, like,
Go to the tape.
yeah, I'm just like, we can
Yeah,
go.
I will
we
watch
can go
that
to
tape.
the
No way I
recording.
said that.
Yeah, that's a matter of cards. We can stack it up.
That's a link.
Yeah, exactly.
Good luck.